Hi, I'm Grant Bartley. There are a lot of people out there arguing for the existence of God, and more specifically for Jesus as God. However, I found that these arguments often either do not recognize vital philosophical nuances or are inadequate at crucial points, so these videos are my attempt at plugging those gaps. For this video, I'd like us to consider the moral argument. The moral argument for the existence of God goes as follows. 1. Without God there can be no objective moral values. 2. But there are objective moral values. 3. Therefore there is a God. This is a logically valid argument, meaning that the conclusion 3 logically follows from the premises 1 and 2. For the jargon fans, this argument is a form of the syllogism called modus tollens. So, since this is a logically valid argument, whether or not this is a good argument for the existence of God depends on whether or not the premises are true. So here I'm going to briefly look at those premises. First though, I should note that the moral argument is not the argument that people can't be moral without a belief in God. Certainly someone can have great compassion and empathy without believing in God, and this and other types of feelings and impulses can and do compel a great deal of good and kind behaviour. Neither does believing in God necessarily make you a good person. The whole history of religion shows us that. But the moral argument is instead the argument that without God there are no grounds for the objective reality of moral truths. That is, there are no grounds for saying that certain behaviours are really right or wrong, independent of what you feel about them. Both premises in the moral argument are contentious. Let's start by considering the first premise: without God there can be no grounds for objective moral values. Do you think evolution provides grounds for morality? I want to consider that idea at length in the next video, so I don't want to go into it deeply now. But basically, the universal nature of moral principles is incompatible with the partisan nature of natural selection principles, so there's no way that the latter can ground the former. The basic principle of natural selection is survival of the fittest, right? By contrast, morality commands benefiting others based not on their genetic closeness to you, but on their intrinsic dignity as self-aware beings. There's no way you can make these two imperatives compatible. The best evolutionary principles can do is to command promotion of the tribe over the individual. But that's not morality, and that's just the start of its problems. If you think that morality can be reducible to the principle of the survival of the fittest, this shows that you don't know what morality is, or maybe that you don't know what evolution implies. What other grounds of the idea that some things are really right and wrong could there be? Perhaps you can think of possibilities other than God, but I can't. The second premise of the moral argument is that some assertions about the morality of acts really are true. This possibility is denied by a currently fashionable moral relativism. Moral relativism is the idea that what is right or wrong is relative to the individual, or another variant is that moral truths are relative to the values of a given culture. Generally speaking, moral relativists believe that morality is only valid insofar as someone believes it is valid. I don't think I even need to go into why moral relativism is logically incoherent. The fact is that the idea that morality is only true relative to your cultural norms is simply false. Regardless of what your culture thinks, murder is really wrong, rape is really wrong, torture is really wrong, abusing children is really wrong. If you don't think that these things really are wrong, then you're deficient in your concept of right and wrong. And if something is really wrong, this fact is not dependent on opinion. Indeed, that's what it means to say that morality is objective. Slavery, for example, is still an evil even in those cultures which condone it, even if this is most cultures, even our own until not so long ago. Alternatively, it cannot be correct that, say, torturing infants could be right, if only we could get our culture to change its sensibilities to become more liberal. The point here is that only someone evil, sociopathic, or overwhelmed by anti-morality dogma could seriously not feel that our sense of right or wrong is sometimes a sense of something true. Ah, rebuts the skeptic, you yourself have exposed the flaw in your argument. You, like everyone else, base your view of right and wrong on what you feel to be morally right or wrong. But what if you had been brought up in a different culture, with different moral sensibilities? There is, it's true, much space for variation in the details of the applications of morality. Nevertheless, there seem to be shared moral fundamentals. I claim that these shared fundamentals reflect objective moral truths. We might say that a general moral principle across cultures is that causing unnecessary suffering and destruction is wrong. The disagreement then is in what needless suffering and destruction consists in. So there are objective moral truths. The difficulty for the non-theist is accounting for the objective reality of these truths. But can God be the grounds of objective goodness? Let's look at the prominent objection to that idea, called Euthyphro's dilemma. In Plato's Euthyphro dialogue, Plato has Socrates question Euthyphro about God as the ground of values. Now Euthyphro was to become a priest of Zeus rather than Yahweh, and Socrates questions him about piety, not morality. But we can transpose the argument there to talk about a monotheistic God as the grounds of morality. In those terms, the horns of Euthyphro's dilemma can be stated as: is what is good good independent of God, or is what is good good because God declares it to be good? If what is good independent of God, then God is unnecessary to establish goodness. Alternatively, what is good cannot be good just because God declares it to be so, as this would seemingly allow anything thus declared to be good. Yet we intrinsically know that even if God were to say that murder and torture were good, this would not therefore make murder and torture good. Therefore, the argument claims that God is unnecessary to establish objective moral values. However, this argument attacks a way of thinking about the relationship between morality and God that Christian theologians, at least, do not typically hold. So it's what's called a straw man argument. First, whether you're a theist or not, we need to define what is good and bad independently of our concept of God, just as the second horn of Euthyphro's dilemma indicates. The definition of morality I use is that it is good to do good and bad to do bad. In more expansive terms, it is morally good to promote intrinsic goods such as pleasure, thriving, beauty, justice, truth, love, and so on, and to decrease intrinsic bads such as unnecessary suffering, injustice, destruction, and so on, while on the contrary, it is morally bad to unnecessarily deliberately increase intrinsic evils or to decrease intrinsic goods. Note that there's no reference to God in this description of morality and immorality. But the Euthyphro argument errs in that an objective definition of good and bad is not itself an objective basis for morality. In other words, just because we know what's moral does not itself give us good objective reasons to be moral. By contrast, God provides reasons for morality in two main ways, I think. The first is the idea that everyone is going to face God's judgment for what they've done in this life. Because we don't want to fall foul of the Almighty if this can be avoided, this is a reason independent of the inclination of your impulses to be good. The fact that we all naturally from time to time do evil is indeed why believing in Jesus is essential, as this provides forgiveness. But that's not the topic of this video. However, being good to forestall bad judgment is not the idea of what it means for morality to be objective that I or Socrates are getting at. Rather, the idea of objectivity is that goodness itself is found in God himself. One way of saying why God objectifies moral truths is because God's character is perfect goodness. In other words, because God is perfectly good, and indeed the perfect example of goodness, God provides a standard or exemplar of goodness, and so objectifies moral goodness. Unfortunately, this is an oversimplification, as it implies that goodness is something higher or better than God which God happens to partake in, and so Euthyphro's points still hold. It is more accurate to say that God himself is the grounds of goodness. This means something like, the very meaning of goodness is part of what God is, or if you prefer, that moral truth exists in its very being in the being of God, who is a spirit. God's existence thereby sustains the existence of goodness. Thus, God exemplifies goodness in the same sort of way goodness is exemplified by the form of the good for Plato. And Plato put forward the Euthyphro argument in order to argue for his forms. The difference is that God is a personal being. So God is a sort of personal platonic good in this sense, if you like. But this is why God is the ground of objective moral values. It was perhaps Dostoevsky who first wrote that without God everything is permitted. But not everything is morally permissible. Therefore, there is a God. Thank you.